All right, everyone, welcome back to another lecture of Comp 426, Modern Web Programming. This is lecture 20. We finally hit 20, and we have 6 more to go after this. I will wait for everyone to settle down before I continue. Thank you. All right, so we're going to get started here with our announcements. So again, remember that the idea submission for the final projects should be completed by tonight in Gradescope. I will go ahead and right after this is closed, I will go through all of them, provide feedback, and you should get feedback. So by the time you're up tomorrow, you will have feedback for your project. That way you're able to go ahead and continue work in F'01 and get started with prototyping. So the prototyping step will also be due next Thursday. There's going to be details regarding, well, the details are already on the document they have access to, but I'm going to just update the links that it goes to it on the website so you have access on what you have to do there. Another thing is that there will be a form that I'll be sending out tomorrow. Please make sure that all teams fill out this form. You only need 1 submission per team. The idea is I want everyone to essentially put out availability for, I believe, the Friday after this one for the kind of these presentations for your project prototypes. So you'll present them to me and maybe 1 or 2 of the other TAs. It'll be only 10 minutes long. Something's not supposed to be stressful. The idea is that you'll be able to get real-time feedback and get approved to continue working on the actual code part of the project. And if you have any questions throughout that, or if you have any questions before you get started that you want to ask, you'll have guaranteed one-on-one time with us to be able to ask those. One thing I will mention is that there is a very large time window of 10-minute slot increments. Please select all, and it'll be written there again as well. Please select all of the time slots that your team will be available. Not just times that you strongly prefer, but all of the times you are available. This will make it a lot easier for us because we have 50 teams that we have to schedule, and I'll be there for all 50 of them, and I want to make sure that we're able to place these teams and get you assigned to a correct time slot in which everyone is available. And if every team only selects like 2 or 3 time slots that they really want to have, it will make it very difficult for me to schedule for everybody, right? So please make sure that, I know it's maybe slightly, there might be a certain time that you wouldn't necessarily like, but as long as you don't have classes, you're not away or have like a job or something, please make sure that you fill it out for there. In the case that there is like absolutely no time that you are available on this day, there will be an option, a check mark, and then we'll work with you to figure out an alternative time. But again, we just really appreciate your cooperation here because this process, there's a lot behind the scenes that we have to do to make sure that all of the scheduling is done correctly. All right, so I appreciate that. And then finally, Alias, a lot of people have been doing great work on that. Hopefully you saw my announcement earlier today. There was one kind of clarification in the instructions that some of the to-do comments, I believe in 1 or 2 of the instructions reference the version of kind of tier of our use querying and invalidating that we did previous semester, which is different than this semester. So there is the correct way of whenever it says like refetch data, using some code, and there's a link there, use what's now in the announcement. It's actually even easier to do and very simple implement, but just want to make sure that you all have that. All right, so again, this is due Sunday. Yes, Sunday. So make sure that you continue your great work there. And then another note here that's not on here, exams hopefully tomorrow. We have 1 more makeup, and then we'll be able to get those out. So apologies for the delay there. All right, so to kind of continue off on our discussion for today, and also I will note, please let me know if the slides, they should be published on the website. So good, okay. It came a little bit late, so if you don't see it, you can refresh your page and it should appear there. Right? So again, what we talked about last time was this idea of these 4 key principles of design. We started out with simplicity, making sure that our pages are easy to navigate and that the content that we put on there is minimalistic. It just includes what needs to be on there in order to satisfy the needs of our user. Right? We then talked about this idea of consistency, the idea that our user interfaces should be visually and also functionally consistent across the different interfaces of our apps, so different pages. Right? We ensure that our design remains consistent. We talked about the importance of this. You saw kind of an example with that crazy website last time, that userinterface.com, of why this is important, because consistency is what informs oftentimes human behavior and how humans interact with these websites. And so if we keep our design consistent to what users expect, that means that our site will be easier for users to use. Then we mentioned user centricity, right? So our apps should be built around what the user requirements are and what the users want from our feature. We, as developers, may have certain opinions about what we should add and what we should not include in our app, but in the end of the day, right, it's up to the users are the ones who are actually using our apps. We want to make sure that the apps we build are relevant and that the features we include help support what the users actually want. And then finally, a really, really big, important key part of design, and there's, again, entire groups that study this, the idea of accessibility, right? And so we want to make sure that even though maybe a decent amount of our users are what we would consider traditional users, there are a lot of users who, for example, may have some sort of non-traditional characteristic. For example, as I kind of mentioned last time, right, if you have some sort of vision impairment, for example, or an audio impairment, you want to make sure that your apps are still usable for those people, especially if your project is being used by a large amount of people. So accessibility is really, really important here. Any questions so far? Great. All right. Now today, what we're going to be kind of expanding on, we're going to really expand on that UI part, the first part of our design, of our two different types of design, where we talk about UI design and UX design. Today, we'll be kind of really talking more about the UI side. We're going to get started with colors, right? So colors are a very important part, right, of design, and they end up having a really big impact on how users identify with our sites, right? So colors make up a very big part of UI designs, and it can separate oftentimes decent or good designs from great designs. Good and proper use of colors where applicable. Another idea here, which helps us to relate back to our core principles of design, is the fact that keeping to a specific color theme will end up, right, helping with our principle of consistency. So if all of our site or our brand uses a specific set of colors, if our feature that we are building also uses that same branding set or the same colors, it helps to promote consistency. In addition, you may even see this a lot of times across different pages. So for example, right, you may have Google Sheets, Google Docs, Google Slides. They're all technically different applications, right? But they're all Google products. And so they share a lot of the same features and same colors, et cetera, because that is, they're all part of the same brand. And kind of building on top of this, right, these colors often have a very big correlation to a company's brand identity. Right? Something like Amazon, right? Amazon, its logo is orange. Orange is what is really kind of the color that really identifies with that, or maybe the brand really identifies, right, by this color. Right? Duolingo, for example, with green, and Netflix as well with red. And you'll often find that if there are different services that are offered, a lot of times these colors can help us to associate what a spin-off service may end up being a part of in terms of a company, right? Because these colors and what they call oftentimes brand identity, which includes something like a color set, right, is very important. Same thing, for example, with UNC. UNC, right, has the Carolina blue. That is the color that goes with Carolina blue, or UNC, right? You have Duke as well. Duke blue goes with Duke. And so you can oftentimes tell just based on signs, even around a campus or whatnot. If you just had a photo, you could tell maybe which campus you're on, or what maybe a certain service or company or even some facility is associated with based on these colors. All right. So what actually ends up making up a color? That is what we're going to kind of go into here. And you may have seen many different types of kind of arrangements of something like this, right? You might see a color wheel. You might see just kind of that inner square. This is a very interesting dial. So there's certain applications. I believe Google uses a dial similar to this if you're kind of searching for a color. There are often, though, many cases where this is shown in a different representation, but there are still three core kind of components that end up you'd be able to modify no matter what type of color picker you are using. Right? So the first one, and we actually have all three of these different pieces here, right? So the first one is hue. And hue is what really defines a color family within a color. Right? So this is kind of that outer wheel that we're talking about here. Right? So the outer wheel is like the hue. This is separating between something like red and orange and green, blue, etc. Right? That's the entire color family that we are selecting. And that's one aspect of a color. The second aspect here is this idea of saturation. And saturation, you probably have heard this term before. You may not necessarily knew what it related to, but it's essentially the intensity, for a better word, right? Intensity of the color. You have something that's really muted, really gray, like this, right? You can see here, we've set the hue now. So the hue is like selected on one. It's like a pinkish color family. And then within that, we can adjust the saturation, which makes it much more gray, muted, versus something that's extremely rich. And that is this measure here of saturation. In this particular diagram, you can see kind of going from left to right on this cube is what will help change your saturation from a really rich pink to a much more muted one. And then finally, brightness, which is just how much darkness is ultimately applied in your color. So you can see this is kind of our vertical example. Here we go from something that's an extremely bright pink to something that's very close to black. And we can adjust the brightness here in order to change that metric. And so in the end, what you end up having is you have all three of these particular pieces. You have hue, you have saturation, and you have brightness. And these three attributes end up making a color for us to use. Any questions so far? All right. So now that we know about these three main parts, right, of a color, we can also represent our colors in code, right? Because, for example, in CSS, if we want to make a text box red or blue, we are going to have to write some style in order to change that color. And in order for us to represent that color, we need to have a common syntax to do so. And so there are many ways that we can actually go about representing colors. So it's not just one particular answer. There are many ways to do so. The first one is kind of this measure of RGB, which you have probably heard of before, which is just essentially you are mixing together three of our base colors. We have red, green, and blue. And depending on the amount of red, the amount of green, and the amount of blue that we supply, we end up mixing that together and we get some resultant color. And so you can see here, we would represent this kind of like this. We have RGB, and then in parentheses, and you can do this in CSS, you supply a value for red, green, and blue. These values range from 0 to 255, right? If you remember back from a class like Comp 211 or 311, you might have an idea as to why it is between this range, or you can think about the number of bits that might be used to represent this color. There's a reason why, right? We're going from, we have 256, right, possible combinations. I believe 2 to the power of 8, I believe. So that's something that you might be able to relate to here to another class. However, more commonly, and something that you may have used all the way back from your personal portfolio, you probably saw in the New York Times Games assignment and maybe Pokedex as well, is this idea of a hex value. So a hex value is represented like so, and it is a very similar combination to RGB, where we specify an amount of red, an amount of green, and an amount of blue that, when mixed together, will create our resultant color. And so you'll see here, we start off with like a pound symbol on the left-hand side, and then we have 2 characters, right? So 0 through F for each character, because this is a hexadecimal value. Again, another relation to maybe something you saw in Comp 211, right? Where we have the same representation, but instead of using a base 10 to represent it, we're using base 16, right? So we have 3F, 89 CC, and I believe that 3F is the same as 160, right? And 89 should be the same as 120. I'm pretty sure I use the same color here as the example, but you could double check me on that. But essentially, same thing, we're just representing it in a different way. And also hex, because we are using base 16 here, it ends up being more concise. right? So we end up only needing to represent a color using 6 characters. And so on most websites, if you're looking for colors or doing color pickers, or anyone's interested in art or graphic design or Photoshop or anything like that, you've probably used this version of our representations here to actually codify a color, right? So this is the hex version. And sorry, you may see me walking back and forth here because I do not have my clicker today. And then finally, we have this other one, which you may have actually never seen before, because this is maybe it's used in a lot of places, but it's often in educational and kind of like intro to HTML, CSS. You may not see this very often, HSL. And HSL is actually more corresponding to the 3 different parts of a color that we talked about in the previous slide, right? So the first 2, you can still get all the same possible combinations of colors. It's just the way that you do so is by mixing red, green, and blue. But here you can actually specify hue, saturation, and brightness directly, and that will end up corresponding with a color. You'll see here we have a hue value, which ranges from 0 to 360, which is like if you looked at that circle, right? It's the angle around that circle to select the hue. And then you have percentages for your saturation and brightness. Question, yeah? Good question. Yeah, so it is a combination of all 3 in the sense that you can make any color. So any combination of hue, saturation, and brightness will make a color, and you can represent that color in different ways. Yep. So I suppose, though, it makes this representation of these 3 different parts of hue, saturation, and brightness is probably the most intuitive out of the 3, because when you're making a color, you wouldn't like just think about how do I mix red, green, and blue together, right, to make some color. You might first want to choose a family and then adjust your saturation and brightness. And this is more kind of aligned with what a user, or not a user, but even a developer or designer may expect. Yeah, good question. But yeah, this representation is kind of codifying the main kind of that diagram that we had before of these 3 different values, hue, saturation, and brightness. Any questions here so far? Right? So most of the time, you probably use hex. And even after today, you probably will use hex. There's a lot of, it's kind of the most concise way, right, of sharing a color. And so that's often what has been adopted. We copy and paste hex codes. But just to note, right, you can easily convert between all these 3 different types of colors. In fact, if I go to a website here, like if I think there's like a color picker on Google. Yep, so here you can see I kind of have the same representation where I have my hue on the bottom, which is a slider. So for example, red, right, orange, yellow, green, etc. And then here I have my saturation adjustment, which you can see on the bottom if you look at HSL, right, what is changing here as I move. Right, so the second value for saturation is now 14%, but if I move over here, it's near 100. And then brightness, top to bottom, you can see here it's higher, and then it goes down to 0. Right, so these are different. You can see, though, that we have all different representations. We have hex, RGB, we even have 2 others that I didn't mention, and then we have HSL. Right, so you can very easily convert between all of these if you wanted to. So if you wanted to select a color, like let's say I want a color like this on my site, right, I can select any of these representations to use. All right. Now, another thing that you may want to add to your colors, and a lot of times this is used in, and you've definitely used this before in various ways, is this idea of opacity, right? We might want to make a color slightly more translucent or much more transparent. And there's a value called the alpha value that we can apply to adjust transparency in a color. So you'll see here that we actually can modify each of our 4 types. So you can, or 3 types, right? So RGB, we can have RGBA, where our 4th value is a alpha value, right? Ranges between kind of the 0 and 1, right? 0%, which is completely transparent, and then 100%, which is completely opaque, right? And you've probably used this before. You may have seen it used as just called opacity. Maybe some apps, I think Photoshop might use alpha. Right? And we can do this for all 3. So even hex, we can do the same thing, where we have a value here as the last 4 or the last 2 digits. And then here for HSL, we also supply a value. And this just controls transparency in a color. All right, questions? Great. So when designing a site, right, ultimately, it is going to be up to you as a developer to choose what colors you want to put on your site or on any app that you're building. And the ultimate set of colors that you will select is what's known as a color palette, right? So a color palette is kind of this combination of a set of colors that you choose that you're then going to use throughout your entire site. And you're probably wondering, and this is a very, very common concern in the beginning, it's like, how do I end up going about creating a color palette? How do I even know if this color is something that should be used or should not be used, right? It seems very open-ended. And so I'm going to show a few things which I think will help with how we think about choosing colors to use in our applications. So typically, the first thing I'll start out with is what are the main key components of a color palette? So again, a color palette, right, is just a set of colors. And we often will have these 5 parts in our color palette. And most palettes will start off with these 5. You can always remove some or add some, but typically this 5 is kind of the set that we end up using. The first one is something like a background color, right? So the background color is what is essentially going to be in the background of your entire site. Right? So like right here, the background of this slide, right, is a white color. That is what is kind of the backdrop of everything on our page. So background color is the first thing. The second thing is this idea of text color. So this is often what is used for plain text. Like here, we have a very dark gray as the text color on the slide that we use. So black, I believe, for the header, and then a darker gray on the slide. This is a text color. And then we have 3 other colors that we will typically select. One is, and I'll back this up actually. First is what we call the primary color. So the primary color is kind of that is our main essential first color that most represents our brand or whatever we will choose. So for example, in Duolingo, the primary color might be that bright green that they use throughout on their logo and in some of their kind of more prominent diagrams, etc. And then underneath those, we have another color called secondary. And the secondary color is often paired with this primary color. And you'll see an example here in a moment. But it's usually a little bit what we call less prominent. I'm going to get to this word prominent in a moment. But you can imagine kind of that if our primary color has some arbitrary amount of boldness, right, the secondary color is going to be a little bit less bold. It might be more muted. Right? We'll get to what we're talking about here with prominence in a second. And then lastly, we often have an accent color on certain pages that essentially pops against everything, like including the primary color. The accent color is used extremely sparingly, and it's only used on certain components. And if you go to certain pages, you may actually be able to pick up on this. I know Google uses this a lot in various apps where there might be only one component on the screen that has this accent color. The idea is that this is supposed to pop against all the colors because as a user, then your eyes are drawn to it. So it is used for very particular actions. For example, in a to-do list, right, you might have a floating icon on the bottom right with a plus button to add a new to-do item, and that might be a much more bold color than all the other colors in various apps. And you can test this out, especially if you're Android, because Google uses this quite a bit. And so the question here, I suppose, is what do I mean by prominence? Because prominence is a very important concept, not only in just UI design, but also it has a very big effect on how users actually use these sites. And so prominence, right, is kind of this idea that there are certain elements that we want the user we want to essentially create a hierarchy, perhaps, of different actions or different elements on the site. And we can visually kind of represent this hierarchy using different colors. And by using different colors, we kind of create this mental hierarchy ourselves. For example, consider these two buttons, right? We have a Save Changes button, and then we have a much more muted, lighter Cancel button, right? Just by using these two colors, we're able as a designer to create a kind of a hierarchy of the prominence of these actions, where Save Changes is going to essentially have a higher, maybe of more importance, or maybe it means that the user, right, is going to see this first as kind of that's the main action, primary action, and then we have some sort of secondary action, which also is there, but by adding slight variations in our colors, we're able to essentially show one and point out one to the user more than another item. This is used a lot. If you go to various sites, you will very often see something like this. If you go even in a lot of Apple devices, you'll see something as well. More often than not, so one example is when you're setting up your phone, you might have kind of this thing of whether or not I believe in iOS, there's two buttons of like, do you allow to send analytics to Apple or do not allow? And the Send Analytics button will often be a very bright blue, and then the Do Not Send will be more of a gray color, right? So that is an example of these designers using prominence to essentially maybe point out that our primary flow, we want you to select this button because that's what's prominent, and then we have a more kind of secondary option. This is also an example here of a color palette that has a primary color being this regular purple, and then secondary being a more muted purple. And we can use the primary and secondary color to establish a prominence here, right? So again, you can see here, it creates a hierarchy of like importance or almost like weight to an action. Another thing that I don't have on the slide, but it's important to point out, a lot of times in apps, you'll have like a deep red for like a deletion button that pops against everything. And that's because we're saying that that is the most impactful item that you can click on the screen. So therefore, it has like the most, it's kind of the most of your data, right? If you have a delete button, that data is not recoverable. It's a very consequential action. And so it's pointed out with very high prominence, right? So you can see here, right, the Save Changes button performs a mutating action. Right, so Save Changes actually performs some, for example, change in our database. That is something that's a consequential action. Something actually is going to be affected by you clicking this. But with Cancel, clicking that is just going to cancel. Nothing is going to end up happening. That's another way that we use prominence. And then lastly, if you've noticed, in a lot of the slides for 426 have used this idea of prominence with our pop-ups. So various pop-ups will have these different shades of color, and that's been done intentionally throughout the slide decks. And we're using this idea of prominence there too, as you can see with our different pop-up items here. Any questions on this idea of prominence? All right. Another really important rule here has to do with how much of a primary, secondary, or maybe an accent color might we end up wanting to end up like using on our site. And there's a rule called the 60-30-10 rule. And in fact, as you can see here, this has been heavily inspired by interior design. So in interior design is where this rule came from, except we can also apply it in the context of our software as well, where a lot of times 60% of items should be some sort of dominant color. This could be the primary color, or in some cases, right, this could be like a background color. The background is majority of your screen, that's 60%. And then 30% of your items, right, might be more of our complementary color or a secondary color. But then you usually have like an accent somewhere, like 10%, which is the highest prominence, and it's used sparingly, even in interior design, right? You don't have one room that has a crazy amount of accent color. You might have just one piece, or like one chair or some like trinket or something on a shelf that really pops against everything else. That is this idea of using this accent color. It draws people's eyes to it. Now that effect though only happens if it's used sparingly, right? If you use that accent color everywhere, then it's not going to cause people to really notice it as quickly as if you follow this type of arrangement. Right? And so, of course, this is not a hard and fast rule where you have to measure the exact percentages, right, of what colors are used. This is just a rough this is usually a rough estimate that is typical in a lot of pages, right? You don't have to follow it again exactly, but as long as you have that hierarchy in mind where your accent color is used very sparingly and you kind of have this relationship between a primary and secondary color, then you're typically good to go. All right, questions here so far? All right, so what I would like you to do now is, and this will be part of our attendance check here, is to check out some sites that you often use today, or any site that you are maybe either on. Hopefully, it's our slides and our course website, but if it's not, that's okay. And just explore and see what are the colors. Can I identify like what might be a primary color, a secondary color, an accent color? And you write this down in Gradescope, and also we'll have at least one site that we'll look at. So make sure that you choose one, and we'll ask for some volunteers afterwards. All right, everyone, I think we have had a good amount of time to look at this. Does anyone have any examples they would like to share? Yeah. Printables.com. So I was walking around and I wanted this one to be shown because I think it's a pretty good example. So printables.com. Is that the correct? Great. Okay. Yeah, so this is actually an interesting thing that we'll talk about. So on the other computer, there was a light mode, or it was a dark mode site. Here I'm on light mode. But you'll notice that if I were to ask, like, what do you think the primary color might be? What would you maybe assume? Either, yeah. Yes, so, and again, in the dark mode, so in your version, that was dark mode, right? It might have been the darker color, right? Most of our site uses this kind of grayish color right in the background. So that might be kind of what is taking up a majority of the page, right? You might have white here and some accents, or black you could consider. And then, right, you have like kind of this one orange button on the site, which really is much more kind of used sparingly. And so that might be the accent color. There are many other site examples as well. Like one I was looking at earlier was FedEx, right? So if you go to FedEx's website, and then select, for example, United States, right? You also kind of see a similar thing where orange is used, right, for that one track button. That's our most prominent item on the page. It's like our accent color. And then we use maybe purple in some cases as secondary, and then gray as secondary, right? So one thing you may have noticed, you may have actually gone through different sites. Sometimes it's hard to get a good sense of what is what is this clear distinction between primary, secondary colors, right? Most of the time, though, you are able to pick up on like an accent color, because that's, again, that is what you're able to see, and that's the entire point of the color, is to try and bring your attention to it. So oftentimes, accent colors are very easy to find. Some sites, again, and this is why the 60-30-10 rule is a bit more open-ended. It isn't a hard and fast rule, but a lot of times designers will try and get something similar to that, because we create kind of a hierarchy then of our colors. So great work there. Now, the good news is that there are many tools that make generating color palettes easy, or at least easier than it typically is, right? So I really like this example here, this real-time colors example. It's really nice because it allows us to see kind of the three main parts of our color palette: text, background, primary, secondary, and accent. And we can even, for example, randomize it. And you can see it actually changing on a real site. So this can kind of give you an idea of a way to play around with these colors and determine what you may want to do, especially for your final project. You're free to choose a color palette, and you might be able to use one of these tools to help create one, right? So for example, right, this one here is pretty nice. Our colors, primary, accent, and secondary, are pretty similar. But again, if we randomize it, you'll see that some of them end up quite different, all right? There's also a great website here called I believe Coolors, colors, cool plus color, right? So this is nice because you also have kind of color palette generators. People create color palettes that then they put up on there. Usually there's like 4 to 6 colors in the color palette. Now, sometimes these color palettes, right, are not necessarily just made for website use. They're made for kind of actual art use. So even if you have one color palette, like let's say I select one here, like start the generator, right? It generates this color palette, right? So obviously this one, it would be difficult to have text and have a background color here, right? It might not look right, but you can get started if you like, for example, the combination of these two colors, or maybe that blue and that blue. You can choose two colors and then start building it up from there. So this is a great tool to use. There's also a kind of, you can see trending palettes as well. You can see it's used in a lot of different, by a lot of different designers at various places. Explore palettes are nice, right? So you can see, like, for example, something like this one might actually be decent, right, for a website, because you can have a background color. You have like a text color, which is the black. And then you can use that orange for an accent color, etc. Right? So again, I recommend using, especially in the final project, and since you'll be prototyping soon, try and play around in Figma, for example, with these colors and see what you like. And you can then customize your site in various different ways. And there's actually another really cool website that I'll share probably later in an announcement. Well, actually, I might as well show it now because I think this is somewhat helpful, called tweakcn.com, which actually allows you to modify, and it gives you the code directly on how to modify the existing kind of blank ShadCN theme to use, for example, different colors and different fonts, etc. So you can see here in examples, right, there's all these different ones. Like, funny enough, right, there's a Supabase one, or like this Quantum Rose, right? It changes the components to a very nice color palette. And you can kind of see, right, we have a background color. We have like an accent there, which is what is used to show that the inbox tab is selected. And this is great because you can take kind of the base ShadCN design system and then modify it using nice colors. So I recommend this. I'll send this out as well in a link later, in an announcement later. Great. Now, another important thing to note, and this is often this is something that goes wrong a lot of times when people are working with color, is this idea of contrast, right? So for example, there is actually a line right here, which if you have it on your computer downloaded, you might be able to see, right? But in the classroom, you cannot see that there's a line of text right there. That's because the color contrast between the color for the text and the color for the background is way too small, right? Or this one, right? We have a gray on top of a navy color. This looks bad to us, right? Kind of intuitively because we can't see anything, but really the terminology here that we use to discuss this is this idea of contrast, right? So contrast is an actual numerical measurement that we can use to determine whether or not two colors are can be overlaid, for example. There's this great website here called it's the same website, Cooler's Color Contrast Checker. And this is great because, as you can see here, you can select a text color and a background color and then see the contrast measurement and see, is this maybe a good pairing? For example, if I continue to make my text color lighter and lighter, you'll notice that the contrast begins to decrease, right? So for a very large text, it's fine because with large text it's visible, but if you have small text, it's not that good, right? And so if I continue to make this color lighter and lighter and lighter, right, you can see the contrast continues to get worse and worse. And so this is something that you can use if you're trying to determine, like, I'm trying to select a background color and a text color. Is this going to be legible? You can use the color contrast tool. Not really sure what was going on with that, right? Another thing that's very common is also certain colors may be very visible on top of each other, or like, this is something that you have probably seen at some point, right? Blue on top of red, and it makes red on top of blue, and your eyes are like, right, this is crazy. Again, you can see here with our color contrast, right, it is a very bad contrast, right? So this is something that I would definitely kind of pay attention to when you are choosing your colors. Great. Again, sufficient contrast is essential. right, for making sure, especially with accessibility. So if there is somebody who is visually also impaired, or if there's color blindness, for example, that they have, contrast becomes a very, very important thing. And that's why having a very high contrast value is always good when you are designing sites with these colors. And I also have the same example of red on top of blue, right? Don't do this because, again, contrast is very bad, and also these two colors do not go together. Now, also another thing which is good to note is that often very high saturation colors are also typically not recommended. If you kind of lower the saturation a little bit, you can see we have this really kind of very intense red and blue, and then we lower the saturation a bit, it becomes a little bit also easier to read and less jarring. So this is another technique that you can use. Any questions here? Great. Another thing here, another tip, right? Background colors are typically neutral. It is not very common to have like a background color that's like a dark blue, right? Or a green or something. The main reason here is, again, legibility, right? Because then selecting a good text color is very difficult unless it's white. And like you have a really dark, like black background with white text, right? That contrast is okay. But again, contrast is the main measure here that you'll want to consider. And black background on white text brings us into also this thing, right, of dark mode. Dark mode is something that was kind of added many, many years ago. I think it started, well, probably didn't start, but it popularized with an iOS update, and then the web started to adopt it, and now all websites have light and dark mode. We have all of our devices work with it too. And so oftentimes in dark mode, what ends up happening is that your color palette, your selection oftentimes, so like your background color and your text color will end up switching. And you'll end up then, for example, this is the slide in light mode, and then this would be the equivalent slide in dark mode. Right? So it's hard to see maybe because of the lighting, but you can see I have a dark background with a very light text. And even above my color, so if you look in the top left for my kind of that M5 design badge, right, ends up changing to be darker with a lighter text. And so in dark mode, you also want to keep in mind your colors and making sure that your colors work for that, right? Questions here? Perfect. And color palettes for Shadcn. So again, I had that one link for that one website. I highly recommend looking at it because it makes importing in colors very easy. So typically in Shadcn, there's like this document, I think maybe colors. My link must be broken because they just did an update recently. And so there we go. I think here's some, yeah. You have often this global CSS file, which is auto-generated by Shadcn, which selects colors. And you actually notice it uses a different type of selection for color than all of the three we talked about. They use this LCH selector. Again, there's many representation for colors, right? So this is kind of a list of variables that it creates in CSS. So if you didn't know, we didn't really talk about in this class, you can create variables in CSS and then use them. That is what is done here. We're essentially creating a bunch of colors, and then we use it throughout. And it's in this style, or in this styles.css or globals.css file. And so a website like Tweakcn allows you to actually, so if I do try now, you can actually, first there's an export to Figma, I don't know about that, but there is like the actual code here with these colors selected, which is why this tool is really nice. However, this is completely editable. You can go in, change colors as you wish, and make a custom template if you like, or like a custom color palette. You don't just have to use a website like this or Shadcn's website, right? This is, and that's the great thing about the Shadcn library. When you add components and use it, it puts everything in your code base, and so it's extremely customizable. You're able to just edit the CSS file, and it makes it super easy. You don't have to kind of worry about like doing all this crazy setup. You have the CSS and you can just edit it directly. It's given to you. And so if you wanted to, for example, change your background and foreground color, right? So if I go back here, it's right here, background and foreground. You can just go ahead and change it to whatever color you want, and it should affect everything. Same thing here. You see primary, secondary, right? These are all colors that exist in this palette. questions here? Yeah. Good question, yes. So there is actually, you can see here, there's a dark class, and then the dark mode is, colors are there, yeah. All right, that's color palettes. There's another thing though, another aspect that is really, really useful and another really big part of UI design, right? So we talk about colors. Another really important one is what we call typography. Typography is this term. It's like a technique of, or it's art or technique of actually using, selecting, even creating cases, fonts or typefaces. So fonts and typefaces are essentially synonyms, right, for how do we kind of display text on our page. And so in addition to colors, right, typography has a really big effect on the presentation, on the style, and ultimately branding of the site that we create. And a font is just a specific style of text. And you've used many fonts throughout the time, right? Google Docs, for example, Word allows you to just select a bunch of fonts. You can install fonts on your computer, right? And so this allows you to change font in documents. Well, you can change the font on your websites as well. And in fact, these fonts can be grouped into kind of these specific categories. And there are these 5 key categories that we often see when it comes to fonts. And most fonts fall into one of these 5. And you can see these here. We have serif, sans serif, handwritten, monospaced, and then display fonts. Right? So you have all of these 5 different types of fonts. Serif fonts are typefaces that include serifs. And serifs are just these kind of lines or decorations right on the extremities at the end of these characters. So you can see there, right, with A on the bottom, we have these little lines, right? That's a serif. And then we have it on our A as well. And so whenever you have a serif font, it's just a font that has serifs on there. In addition, a lot of times serif fonts also, the width of each kind of stroke for each letter may not be uniform. Right, so for example, on the A, you can see that the left-hand side of the A is much more narrow than the right-hand side of the A. Right? That is a stylistic choice, and oftentimes serif fonts use that particular setup. Right? And then we move on to our second type, which is sans serif. And I believe this comes, I am assuming, from Latin. If I'm wrong, I apologize on that from what I remember. But the idea is sans serif is just typefaces that do not have serifs, right? So sans is without. So this is without serifs. And so this font is often you've seen, so you can see on the slide here, right? My slides use this sans serif font. And it is every single stroke, the width of every stroke is typically uniform, right? If you look at any of the characters here in this on the slide, the strokes have very similar widths. And you'll notice that sans serif is the standard font type for most websites, right? So if you go to any website and you're scrolling around, most of the time your body text will be sans serif. It is often considered the most easiest to read. Okay? Now there are cases, especially on certain websites like news websites, that are trying to mimic the old newspaper style. Right? You might use serif fonts, right? Like New York Times, for example, will use serif fonts instead of sans serif fonts. Handwritten fonts. So these are fonts that look as if it was, well, handwritten or maybe written in calligraphy or something like that. I will note, though, this is not commonly used, right, for text on websites. The reason is because it's oftentimes not very legible. So a lot of times it's harder to read than something like a sans serif font on a website. However, in logos, you might see this quite a bit, especially if maybe you are creating a website for a designer or some individual person. Maybe their brand, right? They sign their name or they have like something that they drew. A lot of artists do something like this. So it's very common for things like logos or maybe certain images to include handwritten font because it feels more personal, right? So it's kind of more of a personal human touch to it. But I would not recommend, right, using handwritten font for your websites. The body of the website. Monospaced is our fourth one. And essentially with monospace fonts is that every single every single character in a string has the exact same width and the same spacing. So that's when it says monospace, it's one spacing between and one width for all of these characters. Right? So you'll notice, like if you kind of look at maybe one of these words like this, right? You can see down there, right? The I is very narrow. The S is wider than the I, right? And the amount of space that it actually takes up. Well, with a monospace font, every single character must have the exact same width. And so therefore, you may have kind of what appears to be slightly either uneven spacing or characters have to be adjusted to take up the same amount of space, right? So example right here, we have hello, right? Which the H is very wide, the L is very narrow. But if you notice here, our H and our L have the exact same width in our monospace fonts. And a lot of times you'll see on websites, we use monospace fonts to represent code. So even in my slides, whenever I represent codes, for example, like HTML, JavaScript, TypeScript, use monospace fonts. Your IDEs as well, right? Use a monospace font for code. And so it's also not used oftentimes for the body of a website, but it is used in the context for representing code. Finally, our final type of font is the display font. And display fonts, sometimes this bleeds into handwritten as well, like they're kind of similar. But the idea of display fonts is that they're supposed to be extremely striking. They might be more fancy or bold, right? It draws in the user's attention. Again, it has more prominence, right, than the text around it, which is why it's more visually noticeable. It's not commonly used for the body of a website, but oftentimes on like headers, for example, like an H1, that main title, you might have a display font in some instance. So it really depends on the type of site that you're working with, right? So this is an example here of a display font. Any questions about the 5 different types of fonts? Amazing. So there's a great website here called Google Fonts, and many of you have probably used this already. Google Fonts is an entire archive of all of these amazingly designed, free-to-use fonts that anybody can use, for example, on their site, or they can download to their computer and use it there. And they also have incredible learning resources about the entire world of typography. In fact, I think that Google Fonts is one of the most comprehensive out of all of them. So if I click here on Google Fonts link, it'll take you to this fonts.google.com, and you'll see we have all of these different fonts here. So like Roboto, for example, we have like Elms, Sans, right? We have all these various different fonts we can choose from. And the great thing is that we can also select different they have these different categories like feeling and appearance, right? And then you have, for example, like your serif fonts. So if I want to filter to just serif fonts, I can click that. And you can see all my fonts now here are the serif category. Sans serif, for example, these are all the sans serif fonts that are available. I know they have calligraphy, so you can select calligraphy here. And I know that they have monospaced somewhere in here. Oh, there it is. They put it under appearance for some reason, but there you go. You can see monospaced fonts. For example, this Roboto Mono, that's what we use in our slides for this class, right? And so Google Fonts is a great resource because if you want to use this font, you can click on it and then press on this Get Font, and it will tell you the code in your, for example, web, your CSS code that is needed to import this font directly in. And there's various different ways of doing so. So you can do it using kind of the CSS import, or you can put it inside of your HTML in a link tag. There's various different ways of installing these fonts. And so essentially what happens is that when your browser sees one of these things, like this link tag, it's going to go to Google Fonts server and grab the font file and bring it down so they can render your website using that font, right? So it's still a network, right? Network request for this font, and then it's made available. Another great thing about this is you can click on a font and then also preview text, right? And see what your text might actually look like in a specific font, which is also pretty cool. And as I had mentioned, if I go back here, Google Fonts has a tremendous amount of resource material. In fact, there's so much here that if you're interested in things like fonts, then this is going to be really, really cool for you, right? For example, things like, well, we'll be talking about type in a second, but I mean, they have various different things on like different histories, like the history of Latin, right? How fonts work in other countries with other languages, right? So here, right, Japanese, Korean, things about readability, right? So how does choosing different fonts affect accessibility and readability, right? For example, accessibility in typography, right? So for example, here's a choice between top row, less legible, right? And then a more legible or less readable and more readable. And it really breaks down how all of these things actually work. Because again, in the world of UI UX design, remember, one of our key principles of design is accessibility. And so choosing a font that works well with accessibility is important. Any questions here? I highly recommend, if you are looking at trying to choose fonts for your app, you should look at this and see if you're able to choose one that's different than the default. You might be able to do some pretty cool things. And that website I showed you, TweakCN as well, often changes the font or gives you different options to choose from. There's various different things here that if you're really interested in fonts, right, there's specific terminology, right, in terms of the anatomy of what actually makes up a typeface. Things like, you know, cap height and X height and baseline, which are actually sometimes CSS things that you can modify. Or, you know, for example, terminals. There's all these various terms, right, that are used. So if you're, again, interested in learning more about fonts, this is a great thing to look at. Also, this is something that is definitely something you can affect with CSS, things like line spacing, right? So how far apart are my lines? Things like kerning, which is a fascinating concept, which is the idea that, you know, typically you would think that there is even spacing between all of my characters, except in reality, if you did do something like that, text would actually look pretty, it would not look right. And so with kerning, we end up essentially changing dynamically based on the characters that are placed in order, what the spacing is going to be between those characters so that it ends up looking even, right? So even though on the left-hand side, technically the spacing between the A and the V and the I and the L are the same spacing, right? It looks very off compared to what we have on the right, where even though the space between the A and the V is much more narrow, it is actually, you know, as we would expect it to be in terms of spacing. So all these little things like that, which end up all things that you may experience if you're working on the final project or beyond, right? In the world of using technology, you'll definitely be using fonts for a very long time. So these are maybe things that you didn't really think about, but there is so much work and so much detail that even goes into like individual fonts. There are designers whose job is to literally create fonts for various different, you know, for Google fonts or various other things, right? People sell their fonts as well, et cetera, right? So a lot of work goes into these things. All right. And again, my mic died here, so I'm going to try and talk a little bit more loud as much as I can to replace what the mic has lost. Another thing that you'll see here is this idea of a drop cap, right? So drop cap you may see in certain websites like news websites where the first character is much larger. You'll see this in like New York Times, for example, right? So this is something you can also do and play around with in your sites as well. All right. Another thing that is important to think about, and we'll actually be thinking a little bit more about this 2 lectures from now in terms of different languages and things like that, is the fact that, well, not just, right, English uses the Latin script, and so does other languages. So things like Swedish, Hungarian, maybe. So, you know, there's all these different languages that use these scripts. And then, though, you have also many other scripts out there for various different languages. And remember that fonts, right, are kind of based on a script. So if you have a font for example, the Latin script, it'll work for all the Latin languages, but that font will not work, for example, for Japanese or Chinese or things like Hindi or Korean or Russian, et cetera, because all of these use different scripts. And so essentially, the script is the basis for a font. And as you'll see, even if you store Google Fonts, there are various different scripts that you may, or that font developers might work with. And if you support different languages, you might need different fonts depending on the scripts you support. And in addition, I can imagine, for example, for Japanese and Mandarin, there's thousands of characters. So the font designers there, usually there's actually less fonts available oftentimes because of just how much work has to go into them. Google has one that actually works with all of the languages because Google has the resources to do something like that, and so it's pretty cool. And then I will run by this. I will not really talk about this here, but there's a link for a resource of like how do you choose between serif, sans serif fonts in different applications. I think we already went over a good amount of the do's and don'ts of those, but there is a great resource that you can use to also look at that information. Another thing that's very important is this idea of font weight. So once you select a font, you can then also apply a specific weight to that font. And just like as we've been talking about with colors and even with different types of fonts, right? This entire idea of defining the structure and hierarchy is something that you'll notice in design we keep coming back to. And font weights, with font weights, we can also do that, right? So for example, emphasized items appear thicker, right, than others. This is an idea of font weight. So de-emphasized items appear thinner, which may help your eyes to kind of prioritize what should I read first, and then I'll maybe read the sub-items later. And font weights actually range from, there's 9 different values. There's like 100 to 900 that you can select from. And so in this class and in the slides, right, I have tried, and if you go back to different slides, you'll see that there is an intentional use of font weight. So usually standard bullet points are the normal font, and there may be bolding, and then sub-items are usually a lesser font weight. This has also been done intentionally for the same purpose that we would in a website, which is to make sure to kind of lead people's eyes of where to go, right? So this is very, very useful when designing websites as well. And so this is kind of the scale that you would see when you think of a font weight. Thin 100 to 900, which is black. And oftentimes, right, we only really think about normal and bold. And most text editors only include normal and bold. But there's actually all these ranges of values between that and outside, right? So you have kind of lighter than bold, you have heavier than bold, and then you have medium and semi-bold in the middle as well to select from. Any questions here? All right. And so then finally, we have been using Tailwind, right, as you know, to style our React components, right? So Tailwind is great because it allows us to do many different things, including, for example, very easily modifying things like fonts and text styles without having to kind of mess around with this in a CSS file. And all of the things that we talked about today, things like actual fonts, font styles, font weight, so whether you want light font or bold font, line spacing, character spacing, all of this can be done using Tailwind as well. So there's this great link here to the Tailwind typography docs. And you can see there are details on the side here of how to do all of these different things. So for example, font weight is a big one, right? They have all of the different font weights and the associated Tailwind class to apply those. So like font bold, font semi-bold, font medium, font light, etc. And so you can use these classes to essentially apply your different font weights to text, and as you can kind of see right here. All right. Are there any questions with this? All right, so what I'll note here is going into, so after today, right, I will be looking at all of your idea submissions, we'll get those approved, and then you'll get started with prototyping. And now that we've done this lecture, you can kind of begin to think about how might I use colors, how might I use fonts in my design and in my prototype to maybe better my UI or user experience. And so what you can do is in your designs, and as you submit things or as you're looking at it, feel free to use the resources in this document or in this slide, as well as just thinking about these ideas as you go through. Because a lot of times you're free to use the base shad CN theme. That's totally fine. However, you can often make really, really nice, well done designs if you kind of iterate on that and use these different things that we talked about. So that is all. We'll see you all on Tuesday of next week.